All right, let's dive right into this explainer and objectively break down a 500-acre plot of land out in Utah that literally baffled a team of credentialed PhDs for an entire decade. Now, some folks call this the most paranormal spot on the planet, while others completely dismiss it as a massive hoax. But here is the thing that makes this specific case so fundamentally different: the sheer volume of rigorous, round-the-clock scientific scrutiny that was thrown at it. We're going to look at exactly what happened when highly skeptical scientists tried to measure the absolutely impossible.
To really understand this, we have to start by grounding ourselves in the reality of the Sherman family. Picture this. It's 1994, and Terry and Gwen Sherman, who are cattle ranchers, buy this abandoned property out in the desert of northeastern Utah. For them, it was an absolute dream. I mean, they snagged it well below market value and finally had the 500 acres of open desert they desperately needed for their cattle to just roam freely. They were so incredibly excited to move in that they were totally unaware of the property's history. And honestly, they completely overlooked some incredibly bizarre physical details about the house itself. Here is how the timeline really unfolds. The whole story actually kicks off way back in the 1800s with a historical Navajo curse that allegedly bound skinwalking witches to the land. According to the local legend, during a bitter feud where the Ute tribe was capturing and selling Navajo people into slavery, the Navajo were forced off this specific land. And before leaving, they cursed the area so that witches would take the form of predatory animals, like these massive wolves, to torment absolutely anyone who tried to live there. That's the curse that gave the property its infamous nickname. Fast forward to 1994, the Shermans move in, and by 1996, the claims get so intense that an official scientific investigation begins, running all the way until 2004.
Chapter 1: The Cursed Land. Okay, so how exactly does a dream purchase turn into a total nightmare? Well, it starts right on moving day. When Terry and Gwen walked into their new homestead, they completely blew past some glaring, honestly terrifying red flags. For starters, every single window had a deadbolt. And not just exterior doors, the interior doors between the rooms had locks on both the front and the back sides. Outside, it was just as weird. Heavy iron pikes were driven deep into the ground right at the front and back doors, with these massive chains trailing off them. It strongly implied the previous owners kept exceptionally powerful guard dogs literally right at the thresholds. But the Shermans just chalked it all up to rural paranoia and started unpacking boxes. Chapter 2: The Bulletproof Wolf. The weirdness creeps in on literally day one. It's a real boiled frog situation. While they were unloading their trucks, the family spotted an animal walking toward them in this weird serpentine path from hundreds of yards away. As it passed a fence with posts spaced exactly 6 feet apart, Terry realized the animal was at least 6 feet long itself. It was an absolutely enormous wolf. Strangely enough, and imagine being in their shoes for a second, they felt zero fear. They just watched in this weird sort of trance as the massive wolf walked right up to them, wagging its tail like a totally normal, domesticated dog. It even let Terry's father pet its head. But then, in a split second, it lunged at a calf in a nearby pen, locking its jaws onto the poor calf's head right through the metal bars. So Terry immediately snaps out of the trance and shoots the animal multiple times, even pulling out a high-powered rifle. And nothing. It had absolutely no impact. The wolf literally just absorbed the bullets, eventually got bored, let go of the calf, and calmly trotted off. When they tried to track it into the mud, the footprints inexplicably just vanished into thin air. All that was left behind was this bizarre, foul, chemical smell that just permeated the entire area. Chapter 3: Orbs, Portals, and Panic. Following that insane wolf encounter, the domestic phenomena just escalated step by step. It really shifted the family from subjective confusion right into objective terror. At first, Gwen literally thought she was losing her mind. She'd unpack groceries, leave the room for 20 minutes, and come back to find everything perfectly repacked into the bags. Or she'd hang up a towel after a shower, only to find it somehow relocated to a closet on the total opposite side of the house. But the real objective terror set in when Tara's 70-pound iron post digger vanished from the yard. A week later, he finds it impossibly strung up 70 feet in the air, wedged deep in a tree. That was the moment they realized they weren't crazy. Something was actively messing with them. Outside the home, the strangeness just kept amplifying. Terry would stalk his property at night, desperately trying to find whatever was stealing his cattle. He reported seeing this mass hovering about 20 feet off the ground, kind of resembling a small stealth fighter jet. It was completely silent and shone these multicolored lights down to scan the earth.
And get this, when Terry made the tiniest sound in the brush, the craft instantly turned its lights off, angled directly at him as if it knew exactly where he was, and then just shot away. Worse yet, the family endured these miserable, sleepless nights, listening to tall, featureless black humanoids rapping on their dead-bolted windows, speaking some unknown language right through the glass.
Actually, scratch that. It gets even more unbelievable. Terry was later looking through a high-powered rifle scope while sitting on his porch, and he witnessed an orange orb forming right on the horizon. He described it opening up almost like a glowing oval portal. And inside that portal, in the dead of night, he saw a bright blue daylight sky. From that daylight, one of those black humanoid entities actually crawled out of the portal right onto his property and scurried off into the tree line before the portal just zipped shut behind it. The absolute final straw for the Shermans involved these floating blue orbs. Whenever they showed up on the property, they emitted this intense, completely unnatural feeling of overwhelming anxiety if you got too close. One night, a blue orb approached the house, and Terry's 3 guard dogs aggressively chased it out into the woods. Terry heard them yelping, but honestly, he was too terrified to follow them into the dark. The next morning, he went out looking. They found 3 small, burned-out circles in a clearing, and inside those circles, just 3 stacks of vaporized ashes. That was it. The Shermans immediately put the ranch up for sale.
Chapter 4. The Scientific Investigation. Enter the skeptics. Billionaire Robert Bigelow purchased the ranch and moved in a highly credentialed team of skeptical PhDs. Now, before believing a single word of Terry's wild claims, this team spent an entire year establishing rigorous baselines. They tested the area for hallucinogenic plant spores, they checked for water contamination, and they even conducted extensive psychological assessments on the Sherman family. The results? The scientists completely ruled out environmental and psychological hallucinations. The Shermans weren't crazy, and they weren't hallucinating. Something very physical was happening on that land.
Chapter 5. Inexplicable Evidence.
Once the team ruled out those mundane explanations, they started slamming into impossible logistics themselves. For example, in broad daylight, a calf was surgically dissected in just 40 minutes. We're talking precision cuts and absolutely zero blood left on the ground. Later on, 4 massive prized bulls just vanished from a locked corral. Where did they find them? Unharmed, in a calm trance, impossibly crammed into a tiny, unused trailer that was still wired shut, complete with undisturbed cobwebs on the doors. Even wilder, the metal corral bars they vanished from were found to be highly magnetized right after the event. And speaking of localized magnetic fields, while investigating those, 2 researchers independently recorded their compasses going absolutely haywire. The needles violently shifted away from magnetic north, swinging around to point directly toward a very specific spot deep in the woods. At that exact same moment, both researchers were hit by this horrible, rotting metallic smell. It was the exact same chemical stench Terry had encountered when he shot the giant wolf on his very first day. Eventually, even the hardened scientists couldn't avoid seeing the phenomena firsthand. Toward the end of 1997, 2 researchers were hiding out on a ridgeline at night when they saw an orange orb take shape. They pulled up their infrared goggles and confirmed an oval opening, just like Terry had described years earlier. They watched a large humanoid entity crawl right out of the portal and onto the ground. The creature then took off at a full sprint up the hill directly past them. We're talking maybe 30 feet away, accompanied by that same rotting metallic stench and the incredibly loud sound of crushing shale beneath its massive feet. But then, right around 1998, things just stop. The phenomena abruptly and significantly dropped off. The team stayed on the property, but they were no longer getting actionable data. Think about it. Despite experiencing all of this craziness, recording the magnetic anomalies, documenting the mutilated animals, and compiling literally hundreds of eyewitness reports from PhDs, they still lacked definitive, high-definition photographic proof. Frustrated by this whole situation, Bigelow and the team ultimately pulled the plug on the operation in 2004. They didn't walk away with nothing, though. In terms of theory, the scientists coined and really popularized the concept of high strangeness. The researchers left that ranch firmly believing they were dealing with a conscious intelligence. Whatever entity or entities inhabited that land, it deliberately manipulated the team. It was like it put on a show just for them, but never ever allowed itself to be fully caught on camera or controlled by the scientific method. The researchers were just consistently kept one step behind. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought about the sheer amount of evidence gathered out there at Skinwalker Ranch. You've got a decade of round-the-clock research by brilliant, highly skeptical minds who systematically eliminated hallucinations, hoaxes, and psychology. yet they still directly experienced impossible physics and terrifying biology. If science rules out the impossible, and yet the impossible persists right in front of them.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking Anatomy of an Encounter, the dooryard mimic. Now, we aren't just telling a spooky campfire tale here. We are going to break down a genuinely chilling, first-hand incident out of Maine, turning a terrifying cryptid encounter into a fascinating case study of how a predator actually gathers its data and springs its trap. Let's get into it. Okay, so to really understand how this entity isolates its prey, we first have to define a crucial piece of local geography from the source material, the dooryard. It's a specific term used up in Maine for that patch of dirt or gravel right outside your door. Think of it as a liminal space. It's not quite the absolute wilderness, but it's definitely not the safety of your living room either. And as we're going to see, this exact threshold is the theater where this predator plays its most terrifying games. So picture this. Our subject is a 61-year-old guy who took early retirement to finally write his novel. He wants absolute quiet, right? So he rents this winterized fishing camp in Lubbock, Maine. Literally the easternmost town in the U.S. We're talking the absolute edge of the map here. He's at the end of a dead-end dirt road, totally boxed in by hundreds of acres of dense, dark state park forest. And crucially, this is a huge detail. There is absolutely zero cell phone signal inside this cabin. He is entirely cut off from the modern world. And man, that lack of connectivity, it leads to a colossal mistake. Because he had no signal inside, his daily routine became walking down to the nearby cove every single evening right at dusk to get a bar. With the dark tree line at his back, he'd loudly call his daughter, Rachel, just to check in. Without even realizing it, he was broadcasting his voice and her name out into the wild. He was unwittingly handing this creature raw, unfiltered audio data. Now, what's so fascinating about this timeline is how methodical the entity is. This wasn't some sudden aggressive attack. It was an escalating test of defenses. First, the landlord's old dog, Mo, gets absolutely terrified of the back tree line. A few days later, our guy hears an exhausted, crying child out in the pitch-black woods. I mean, that is a sound engineered specifically to trigger human rescue instincts, right? Next, it's a woman's voice calling a two-note, hello, hello, and then finally, things get specific. A warped, distant voice calling his actual name. The entity is literally A/B testing auditory lures, seeing exactly what might drag him outside. With zero internet at the camp, our isolated rider is forced to drive to a local store's parking lot just to get online. Sitting there in the cold cab of his truck, he starts searching his terrifying experiences like he'd Google symptoms for a cold. He types in, "thing in the woods imitating human voice." And well, the search engine drops him straight down a terrifying rabbit hole of cryptid lore, pointing him toward the concept of a skinwalker, a creature known for mimicking voices to draw people out past their doors and into the trees. Desperate for answers, he talks to a local handyman named Errol. Now, Errol completely shoots down the term skinwalker, explaining it's a Navajo concept that's entirely out of place in the deep woods of Maine. But while he rejects the internet lore, Errol absolutely confirms the danger. He delivers this chilling, definitive warning. If something out there has started to call you, do not answer it. Errol explains that these things, whatever they are, they listen and they learn. Basically, the more you speak, the more ammunition you're giving them. Right after this warning, the whole encounter shifts. It goes from spooky audio to intensely physical, bringing this wave of sensory terror. Think about it. A normal animal carcass in the woods smells like a dead deer, and that scent clings low to the ground in a ditch. But the scent this entity brought into the dooryard, it rolled in as a thick, sweet rot. And the absolute worst part is that the smell hovered high up in the air, exactly at the height of a human face, lingering right there outside the door. Let's look at how the physical manifestations keep cranking up the tension. While washing dishes one evening at dusk, he finally spots it. He sees reflective eyes glowing in the dark spruce trees. But those eyes? They're positioned a full 7 to 8 feet off the ground. And then comes the knocking. 3 deliberate, precise knocks on the back wall of his camp. Again, they aren't at eye level. The impacts are hitting the wall near the ceiling, 8 feet in the air, in a spot where there are absolutely no tree branches to blame it on. It is a calculated display of unnatural size and intelligence. The next morning reveals the horrifying mechanics of this creature's disguise. He goes out and finds tracks coming from the tree line that start off looking exactly like normal split deer hooves, standard for the Maine woods. But as those tracks get within about 10 feet of his cabin, they seamlessly metamorphose. The deer print literally stretches out and opens into an elongated, flattened foot with too many splayed toes pressing incredibly deep into the dirt at the front. It's as if the creature physically dropped its disguise the closer it got to his walls. Which brings us to the agonizing climax of the story. The man's daughter, Rachel, picks up on his escalating panic over the phone and unexpectedly drives up to check on him. So now they are both trapped in the cabin at 2 a.m. when the creature makes its final move. It comes right up into the dooryard. But it doesn't growl or scratch. It flawlessly mimics the daughter's voice. And then it perfectly mimics the father's voice. It actually takes turns, using their own voices to speak to each of them from the darkness, pleading with them to step outside and help.
But here is the detail that absolutely cements the horror of this encounter. The creature didn't just string random words together. It spoke this exact sentence. "I'm fine, kiddo. It's just an old man's nerves and an old camp." That is, word for word, the precise phrase the father had spoken into his phone while standing out by the cove a few nights prior. This proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the creature had been standing silently in the spruce trees just feet behind him, absorbing his phone calls and perfectly recording their private conversations.
Obviously, they refuse to open the door, they survive the night, and they flee the very next morning, leaving all his stuff behind. The father drives hundreds of miles south to the presumed safety of his home in central Massachusetts. But the nightmare? Yeah, it isn't over. Weeks later, at 1 a.m., he hears a familiar scratching at his back door. He looks out the small glass window and sees his landlord's dog, Mo, the exact same dog he had left behind in Maine, sitting on his Massachusetts porch, wagging its tail. Or at least something wearing the shape of that dog. As he stares at this dog through the glass, the sensory anomalies just pile up. First off, it's freezing outside, but the dog isn't producing any fog when it breathes. And its body has this deeply unsettling held stillness, like a mechanical arm just waving a tail appendage back and forth. But the absolute worst detail, its flat, green reflective eyes aren't in the dog's head. They are floating a full foot in the air, directly above the sitting dog. And then, the ultimate betrayal. The dog opens its mouth and it speaks in the voice of Wendell, the landlord from Maine. It says, "Let him in, he's cold." So, what's the big takeaway here? The source material makes this absolutely brilliant analogy, outlining how this creature functions almost exactly like beta artificial intelligence. Think about it. Phase 1, it observes the target while remaining perfectly hidden in the tree line. Phase 2, it collects audio training data by passively listening in on daily habits and phone calls. And finally, Phase 3, it processes and rearranges that data to output a flawless, emotionally manipulative mimicry designed to lure the target outside. It's essentially a highly evolved, data-driven predator. Which leaves us with this final, deeply unsettling question to end our explainer today. We all like to think we'd be totally rational, right? We all like to think we'd hit the nail on the head, remember Arrow's warning, and just keep the door bolted shut. But really imagine being in that situation. If you were sitting in the dark and a creature just outside the door perfectly projected the desperate voice of someone you loved begging for help, could you really resist the instinct to answer? Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer. And hey,